How about now?
Great.
Okay, good morning and welcome to Crossroads. Crossroads is a joint production of Town Square Media and the Network of Religious Communities. On Crossroads, we discuss the life journeys and community service of our guests. I'm Rabbi Jonathan Freirich here in Buffalo at Temple Beth Zion, and I welcome you to Crossroads. The Network of Religious Communities is this amazing organization of denominations, congregations, and religious organizations located in and serving Western New York. We are every religion you can think of: Baha'i, Buddhist, Christian, Hindu, Jewish, Muslim, Sikh, and Unitarian. Together we celebrate the wonderful religious diversity of Western New York. Joining me today is perhaps one of my favorite people in the world, Rabbi Mike Moskowitz, who you're in Brooklyn at the moment, yes?
No, West Side, New York City.
On the west side of New York City. So here we are on a Sunday morning, and both of us are doing this from our homes because we are still in the middle of the New York pause. We are going to attempt to bring some light from our traditions to this time where light has not been so easy to find. And so who is Rabbi Mike Moskowitz? Well, you may have met Rabbi Mike, or Mike as I call him, as my friend on Pride last year on 2019. He was the very uniquely dressed ultra-Orthodox rabbi in a black hat and a black overcoat, walking with me as I was carrying a Pride flag down Elmwood Avenue. He came and taught that weekend here in Buffalo. And if you are just tuning in and wondering, yes, he is an ultra-Orthodox rabbi with 3 ordinations from 2 prestigious places of learning here in the United States, in New Jersey, and 1 in Israel, right?
Yeah.
And as such, has a very interesting background. He is also, as we say in the Jewish world, Baal Tshuva, meaning somebody who didn't grow up very strictly religious and became religious, and we'll talk about that as well. But really, his current job is the scholar in residence of trans and queer Jewish studies at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, which is the largest LGBTQ synagogue in the world, and it's in Lower Manhattan in New York City. So I'm going to ask you this question because I'm sure no one has ever asked it of you before. How does somebody with your background end up working in this type of synagogue doing what you do?
Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for the invitation to share. Yeah, it's been a journey, and I certainly didn't go to rabbi school to study this. In fact, it wasn't at all in the syllabus. But for like most people who get involved in this level of advocacy, its genesis was in something personal. Someone in my family transitioned a number of years ago. Someone in my family also came out as queer. And while I was a rabbi at Columbia University in the old Broadway synagogue, while this was happening, a congregant of mine was really struggling with both the religious and their trans identity, not wanting to choose between the two. And there was just a huge void. There were no resources from within the Ultra-Orthodox world. There was nobody who felt comfortable having clarity in how to be supportive and how to give guidance. And so as a result, I tried to fulfill what we're taught in Pirkei Avos, to try and to be the person when there isn't a person in that space, to network the needs and the resources. But unfortunately, the platform that I had at the time was short-lived. I was relieved of my duties and ended up working in a deli, in a kosher deli in Lakewood, New Jersey. And about 1.5 years later, while I was at the deli, I took a day off to go and be part of an act of civil disobedience for DACA in the Senate Rotunda in DC. And in the back of the police wagon, there were 5 male-identified rabbis separated by a mechitza, a metal partition, 5 female rabbis.
So wait, you were arrested?
I got arrested, yeah, sure. I was arrested, I was in handcuffs, and it was in the back of a police wagon.
You didn't start out in the police wagon in the protest?
No. It was part of a great group of folks with Ben the Ark and a bunch of other, rabbis and leaders that felt that the government's policy in posture towards DACA recipients was unholy and unjust, and we wanted to protest it with a Jewish perspective. And so the back of this police wagon, the woman across from me says, we're a bunch of rabbis. Does anyone have any tzira, any spiritual thoughts to share? And, we're all in handcuffs. It's a captive audience. And I had just written an article on gender and clothing, and I shared. And we got to talking, and she found out that I was working in a deli, and then I got fired. That woman was Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, who's my boss. She's kind of the first out queer, rabbi to get employed. She's the first rabbi of CBST, and she's now been there, since the early 90s, and is an amazing leader and an advocate and ally to the trans community, and is also a street advocate. Has been arrested dozens of times. So that's how I ended up at this job, and I just started my third year, and it's been an amazing opportunity. I've published now about 80 articles since I've been there. I'm working on the second book called Graceful Masculinity that looks to explore where gender lies within the Jewish tradition, and to provide more positive language for masculine attributes within interpersonal dynamics.
Yeah, and just to appropriately plug you, your first book of articles is called Textual Activism, and it came out, about a year ago?
Almost a year ago, yeah.
And you just had an article published in the blog of the Times of Israel, right?
I did, yeah, on homophobia being the real abomination, where I, from kind of this unique perspective of probably getting more questions at the intersection of the ultra-Orthodox experience and gender and queer identities, get more questions than probably anyone else, just bearing witness to the struggle and the sacrifice and the deleterious effects that denying the queer experience has provided and forced within the ultra-Orthodox world, that itself is the abomination that the verse comes to warn against.
And this piece actually is really powerful, because here we are, we are now more than 50 years after Stonewall. Mm-hmm. We are witness to a significant amount of success in Pride, and the understanding that, as you've said, really when we recognize that there's somebody in our lives whom we haven't seen honestly, and then we have to confront who they are, and we have to draw near to them and understand, oh, this isn't a stranger doing some strange thing. This is my loved one who is doing something that I didn't understand before, and now I have to figure out how to understand it. And so this is the essence of Pride. The essence of Pride is, if we're in the closet about who we are and we come out, then the people around us will say, oh, this is not some weirdo that I don't know. This is my relative, and I have to grapple with who they are and who I am as well. And so this is a very powerful catalyst for change. It's one of the reasons, and perhaps if we were to do a social analysis, why change on homophobia has been easier in the United States than change on racism.
Exactly right. Because it's much easier. Yeah, that's exactly right. Because it's much easier to get to know somebody, realize that they're an amazing human, find out that they happen to be trans or queer, where the color of a person's skin is often much more recognizable. And then we carry those prejudices with us. And
then you hinge on this word abomination. And the two large communities that focus on biblical literalism are, in fact, interfaith communities. We have Orthodox and Ultra-Orthodox Judaism that says each word of the Torah is not just divinely inspired, but in fact, the word of God. And then we have fundamentalist Christians who say the same thing. And to bring your textual activism, as it were, to this word abomination in Hebrew, to the word toeva, and to say, maybe this word doesn't mean what we think it means. And in this, interestingly enough, you're following, so many people would say, well, how is that still Orthodox? How is that still authentically Jewish? And I like to think of you, to a certain extent, being, there is a scholar from the 12th century named Rashbam, to his grandfather, Rashi. And these are two, Central French and German scholars in the Rhineland of Central Europe during the heyday of the Middle Ages. And they are having a textual argument between the generations. Rashi often says, here's what it means because of a story. And Rashbam, his grandson, says, no, Grandpa, that's not what it means. That's what that story says it means. What it means, according to the text, we have to look at the different places that word appears. And you did that kind of deconstruction on Toeva, on this word abomination. You said, how is this word used? Does it really mean what we think it means? And I thought it was brilliant. You want to explain what, now that I've set it up, do you want to explain this?
Sure, and thank you so much. In fact, the medieval commentator Rashi on the piece of Talmud explains that the word toeva, as the verse frames it in a heteronormative way, that a man, when he kind of errs by being dishonest and deceitful to his wife, to be with another man on the side, right? That he shouldn't be with a man the way he is with a woman when he's in this heteronormative, right? So it speaks to a level of deception and dishonesty. We find the same word toeva used just owning unfair weights and measures. If a person has one weight for buying and one for selling, just owning it is a biblical prohibition. And the word that's used in that verse is toeva because it's deceitful, right? That just its existence is deceitful. It's also the word that's used in the biblical prohibition of wearing misgendered clothing. And I think it's most analogous to, in our times, a person who dresses up as a doctor to gain access to patients, right? There's nothing wrong with being a doctor. There's nothing wrong with dressing up as a doctor, right? The toeva, the dishonesty, that which is abhorrent to God, that which is an abomination, is when a person misrepresents themselves in order to gain access to intimate spaces and relationships. So if a person, and this is really what these fundamentalist communities have forced queer folks to do by denying that queer reality, is that they're forcing people to be in relationships with another where they're misrepresenting themselves because they can't be out as who they really are. Each story is so unbelievably painful, and the way in which it affects children. And there's a rise of HIV within hetero communities because there isn't space for people to be out, to get educated, to be able to be honest, to be in exclusive and monogamous relationships. And all of that is because we're kind of denying, the reality, which is the purpose of, I think, of every religion, is to strive for truth, to try to embrace, right, some sort of understanding, especially of that which is so foreign. And I think, kind of borrowing language from the queer community, in the Jewish tradition that we're preparing for Shavuot, the divine revelation, which I see as like God's coming out speech, right? Because, how is it that we're supposed to know who another is? And if we think about the need to come out, it's predicated on one not being able to understand or having not understood the other. Because if you know who I am, I don't need to come out to you, right? And how painful it must be from God's perspective that now we've forced God back into the closet, right? God is absolutely in hiding because just 40 days later, right, with the sin of the golden calf, God's saying, I don't understand. Like the first of the 10 Commandments is like, I told you who I am. I am the one thing that was never created, and right? Like I am the infinite source of the universe. And now you're like bowing down to this golden calf. Like, I don't understand. Like, how is it that you can't see me for who I am, right? And it was just too painful.
And let me just catch everybody up to our conversation because it's so good. If you're just joining us on this Sunday morning in May in Buffalo, this is Crossroads, which is a joint production of Town Square Media and the Network of Religious Communities. I am Rabbi Jonathan Freirich, and giving us amazing amounts of wisdom is Rabbi Mike Moskowitz. So I'm from Temple Beth Zion. Rabbi Mike is from Congregation Beit Simchat Torah in Lower Manhattan. And we are talking about, and really this idea of being who we are truly, of truth in presentation, and the Hebrew word emet, which is identified as a central word in Judaism because it as truth, it not only embodies this idea of truth, but it's a special word. It has the first and the last letters of the Hebrew Aleph Bet in them. So it starts with which is Aleph, and ends with T, which is top. So that's like starting A to Z. And in the middle, it has the middle letter. The first two letters by themselves spell mother, and the second two letters by themselves spell death. It is life and death. Truth is everything. And yet, what you pointed out in this God coming out experience, right? That God reveals God's self at Sinai. So we have this experience as a people of encountering God in God's selfness. And God gives us some very basic ideas, especially the idea that God cannot be contained. And then what do we do as a people? We squash God into a not just a box, which we eventually do as well, but we put God in the closet eventually, but we place God into the image of a golden calf. And any one of us, told by others who we must be, face this incredible difficulty. And I think you offer this beautiful teaching about the Jewish holiday of Purim that says there is an essential aspect of Judaism asking us to figure out how to be on the outside as we are on the inside. Even the box that contains God, right? The Ark of the Covenant. If you want to see a good representation of it, go watch Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's actually pretty good. Is gold on the outside and gold on the inside. And in the Talmud it says, we understand why you'd put gold on the outside, because it's decoration. But why should we put gold on the inside? And the teaching is because we as people of integrity need to be on the outside as we are on the inside. And God is giving us that model even in the container for the Ten Commandments. So tell us about how Purim, for those of you who don't know what Purim is, it's basically Jewish Mardi Gras. It's a drinking and dressing up holiday. It's based on the Book of Esther. We tell the story of the Book of Esther, which is a later book in the Hebrew Scripture. And we have costume parties, and we're allowed to dress up. And it seems to break all the rules that are so rigid. So you brought forward this teaching from this medieval scholar Rashi again, a medieval scholar. This is not like some radical in 2020. This is not even a radical in 1100.
That's right. Purim itself is actually, I think, it's a time that's very much resonant, I think, for me right now, in that it's a story of exile, right? It's between the two temples. It's in a foreign land. God is very much hidden. But just like at night, things don't go away. We just can't see them. So God's name is not in this book. The hero of the story, the woman Esther, her name means hidden. We have a custom to eat these hamantashen, which has like concealed fillings. And our rabbis also tell us that it parallels the divine revelation, in that when God revealed God's self, there's an aspect of religious coercion there, right? Because if you're actually able to experience God, you lose free will, right? Because if this is really our creator, how do you say no to the master of the universe, right? Face to face. However, because God was hidden, we were able to kind of accept it out of love. I think there's a really deep understanding that intimacy is an invitation. God models this. This is the custom within the Jewish tradition as well. Friday night when we turn to the Shabbos bride, regardless of our gender identity or sexual orientation, we say like, hey, we're interested. And then we wait, not for the absence of the no, but for like enthusiastic consent. And so for the relationship with God, and for a people, it required being able to recognize that which is below the surface. And so one of the ways in which we're able to kind of embody that is that we wear masks, we dress up to show that really the external is that, it's superficial, right? It's not what makes us who we are. And we're able to kind of embrace and really kind of portray out to the world that we know what's real, right? We know that if we want to have a relationship with God as a parent, then we really need to be able to treat each other and not just see each other as siblings. And so we give gifts to the poor, we send presents, right? We embrace very much kind of the interpersonal because by the divine revelation, there was this unique unity, right? It says that ki ish echad b'lev echad, that the people were like one person with one heart. And that is, again, achieved during this holiday of Purim, where everybody comes together as echad. And it's really interesting. We just read about it this past week, that perhaps the golden rule, to love another as we love ourselves. Rashi, again, the medieval commentator, says that this is a big principle of the Torah. And there are many different interpretations of why was that necessary as a commentary. But if we think about each person being created in the image of God, the God that has no image, there is a unique portal into the understanding of the divine. And in order to be able to really meet God as God's self, we needed to be able to be unified as one people, being able to see all of the many different faces of the divine creation, both by the giving of the Torah and also in the Purim story. And that itself is so necessary to understand the divine will, the divine word, because each one of us is a letter. And therefore, I bring my own unique perspective, right? Because of my own unique life experiences. But so do you, and so does the next person, every single person. So the only way that we're able to actually understand the divine will is to be able to understand each other. And as a straight, white, cis male who has some sort of education, that kind of privilege makes it actually impossible to understand what it's like to get pulled over by the police and be afraid, right? But if I love somebody who's a person of color, who that is their experience, right? There's a way in which I can be so enraged, right? That's the lived experience of so many people. That like I can stand up and try to do something about it and try to listen, as an ally. That's, I think, the most important thing to do is to engage in active, humble listening. And that's what God wants from us. Like if we're supposed to understand God, we need to listen to understand God's experience. And if we want to understand the inequities of this world, then we need to listen to the experiences of those. And by doing that, being able to love another like we love ourselves, in that way we can actually come to understand the Hebrew Bible and the divine will.
I love that. And we're going to come back. I think we should come back to listening. I just want to remind everyone, this is Crossroads. It's a joint production of the Network of Religious Communities and Town Square Media. I'm Rabbi Jonathan Freirich, local here in Buffalo, speaking with Rabbi Mike Moskowitz, a teacher and scholar in residence at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah in Manhattan. And I think it is a radical idea for religion in America to think that God needs something from us. It's a fundamental idea in Judaism that to a certain extent, God goes from being everything, being infinite, to self-reducing in order to make space for creation. And therefore, God is seeking our partnership. Our partnership because the universe is far more interesting with partnership than alone. And therefore, God is looking to bring godliness into the universe through us. Love your neighbor as yourself, love another person as we love ourselves is part of an entire section of the Torah focused on holiness, where God reiterates over and over again, be holy like me. Holiness is this idea of emulating the divine. So to listen to another, to deeply listen, to self-withdraw, to create the space for another to self-express and tell us how to help. Tell us, and then you threw in privilege, which is really this idea that you and I, well, basically, even though we look different, we're basically white guys. We're, interested in women, and we have children by women with whom we've been interested, and that gives us a certain leg up in society. Even as Jews who have faced persecution at different times, we are not made uncomfortable overall by society. When I was pulled over in college and in my car driving with my African-American friend in the passenger seat, he was terrified and I was fine. And so it is incumbent on us to figure out how to make the world more just by listening to what we are not. whether that is a person who is oppressed or a person who is God. And this stance of humility, this stance that I, generally speaking, have the privilege of being who I am in public without being oppressed. And then we take that to the issue of masks and Purim, right? Where I get to put on something else. And the something else may be closer to who I am. And then there was something in the news this week. There was somebody who said, I can't put on a mask because I'm not allowed to cover up the image of God.
Yeah, I'm familiar. So as Jews, right, we don't see God as having physical, corporeal existence, in that God doesn't have a body, right?
You don't think God looks like us.
Right. Right. I think probably God is better looking than I, but
Hopefully than both of us, for sure.
Yeah. So what I think is a really important piece is that God has told us what's important to God. And in fact, there's a very famous piece of Talmud that's based on the story of Abraham inviting guests. Abraham is in communion with God, like he's in a prophetic state. God is speaking to Abraham, and Abraham says, listen, I have to go and tend to the needs of the passerby, of the stranger, right? And the Gemara says, you see from there, that Gadol hachnasos orchim yoser mekabos b'nei Shechina, that it is a greater, from God's perspective, it is greater to invite guests than it is to even welcome the divine countenance, the divine face. So when we think about where is God, right, and seeing God and the image of God is in compassion. It's in, being able to take care of those who need it. So the whole thing is offensive, and again, we're all suffering from the trauma of religion, and this is part of that, right? We're overdue for some restorative religion. Religion used to be the scaffolding to help support and contain a relationship with God. Now, very often, it excludes people, and so if we think about the human experience as not being independent of the divine, but really mimicking it, right? As you mentioned, the idea of giving and contracting, we find the intersection of the infinite and the finite, both in scripture, in that there's a finite number of letters and words in the Hebrew Bible, but we believe that it's God's wisdom, God's word, it's infinite, right? These are God's thoughts, and they're infinite. And so too, within a human being, there's a physical body that is finite. However, it has a soul, which is eternal and infinite. The need to be seen and understood is actually not just human, it really comes from God. The Medrash, our kind of homiletic teachings, also very early, from about 2,000 years ago, teach that the emptiness and void in that original Genesis narrative is actually God's loneliness. It's not good for us to be alone because we're creating the image of God. It's not good for God to be alone, right? When we think about God as being needy, it's not an imperfection. God is perfect. But God has a need to give, and you can't give if you're all by yourself. And so God is benevolent. God is kind. God is forgiving, right? God is not offended when we cover up our faces in order to protect the well-being of God's children, because it is emphasizing the holiness that exists and the divine mandate to guard and protect and be proactive to make sure that people are healthy. And so it doesn't need to be named, but selfishness and prioritizing one's own desires in the name of God is not new. But in the pursuit of truth, it's important to recognize our need to put the divine will. And we do have the custom to wear masks in this holiday, in particular to highlight, right, the need to be able to see people as the most essential part, that the most pronounced identity of any human being is that of being created in the image of the divine.
And of course, as we close, here we have an overlap between Jewish teachings and the teachings of our governor, who says that to be a New Yorker, is to be tough, is to be disciplined, is to be loving. and that we understand that when we wear a mask on Purim, it may be self-expression. And when we wear a mask now, it is not for our own safety, it is for the safety of others. It is out of respect and compassion and love for all of creation. And with that, Mike, thank you so much for joining us. Rabbi Mike Moskowitz from Congregation Beit Simchat Torah in New York. I'm Rabbi Jonathan Freirich from here at Temple Beth Zion in Buffalo, and we wish everyone a very safe and healthy Sunday from us here at Crossroads and at the Network of Religious Communities and at Town Square Media. Have a wonderful and safe day. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.